The most overused ability inside of JJK would have to be the domain expansion. Oh well, in Ijitori's case would have to be Black Flash. But what happens if one of those abilities ended up seeping into the My Hero universe? And imagine only quirkless people could attain that ability. Imagine if quirkless people were seen as gods and not seen as some form of curse, along with the rest of the humanity. Imagine if they were feared and seen as gods. But we find that out today in chapter 1 of What If Deku Had Domain Expansion.
Inko looked to her child with eyes that only a mother could possess. The sense of unquestioning love, devotion, and caring that would have her lay down her own life to protect him. Her son. Her poor Izuku. He sat beside her, eyes staring, unfocused and forward. When he blinked slowly. When he moved, if he made any movement at all, it was sluggish, as if he was only half awake. She reached out and ran a hand through his wild and untamed mess of hair. He looked to her like he was moving through water and gave her a weak smile that almost shattered her heart. He was in so much pain and she couldn't do a damn thing about it. This was the worst punishment anyone could have given her, and the knowledge of it weighted so greatly on her soul she thought she would break down. Her only son, the only son she could ever and would ever have, was suffering, and it was entirely beyond her control to stop. Midoriya? Inko looked up to the doctor, who was patiently sitting, fingers linked, at a smart desk with a computer screen to one side and several files to the other. The office was almost stifling from its clinical nature, with its wall-mounted charts, clean plastic examination bed, and even down to the uncomfortable chairs the Midoriyas sat in. The doctor had tanned, Indian skin, a balding head and a soft, middle-aged roundness to his features. He adjusted his thin glasses for a moment and opened a manila folder in front of him. It seems Izuku has finally begun responding to our treatments. It took a while, but we've managed to control the hallucinations, though I'm afraid they may reoccur should he use his quirk. Inko nodded, feeling as though if she tried to speak she would simply sob. Instead, she gripped the purse on her lap harder, allowing its firmness to calm her already ruined nerves. She knew that it wouldn't do much. Her hair was already a mess, always falling out of the short bun she tried to keep it in. Her clothes were form-eating, mostly to hide her weight gain and because it was easier to just throw them on than to dress up any nicer. After all, it wasn't as if she was dressing up for anyone. As for the scarring, there is little we can do other than recommend some dermatological oils and products, as you said don't wish to subject Izuku to any extensive surgery. No, not if they're just going to keep happening, Inko mumbled almost to herself as she gave a weak shake of her head. Have you noticed any more flare-ups? The doctor seemed to continue unabated. She wondered briefly if it was because he had seen so many young children like Izuku, or if it was simply because he was pressed for time and wanted to go for lunch. She had met a fair few of them by now, enough to know when they were simply shoveling the problematic 6-year-old off onto someone else for a while. No, I don't think he's used it since we were last here. She looked to Izuku and smiled softly to her apparently dreamy child, again running a hand across his head. Izuku? Sweetheart? The young boy turned to look at her again. She swore she could see his thoughts drift through his eyes, slowly, like boats moving along a muddy river. Have you used your quirk at all lately? The boy seemed to consider this question before slowly he shook his head. Okay, that's fine. Inko blinked back her tears and looked to the doctor again. He's become so quiet. I don't like how the medication is affecting him. He used to be so full of energy and now. I don't know. Miss Midoriya, you must understand, your son's quirk, combined with his traumatic experience, has caused him to develop these disorders. Without medication he would be far worse off. The doctor paused and then sighed, taking his glasses off for a moment to pinch the bridge between his eyes. For a second, Inko saw there was an actual human there behind the white coat and smart blue tie. I know this is hard for you, I really do. I have seen many children Izuku's age and some even younger suffer from their first quirk usage being traumatic in nature. Though your son's case is an extreme one, he is not the only one to have these symptoms. He paused again for another moment as if wondering if he should go on before adding. I know of another child, Izuku's age actually, who suffered from something very similar. Schizophrenia brought on by a traumatic quirk usage. Inko leaned forwards at the news, her eyes growing wide. See, can I ask who dash? I'm sorry, but the child's name is confidential. The doctor shut her down swiftly. However, he allowed a smile to grace his lips as he added, be assured however that they are making progress, they are healing. I believe that with time and with continued use of the medication Izuku will heal too. Inko gripped her purse again. She wished for all the world that things could be different, that her son could be the happy, energetic child he used to be. Now he seemed like a shell, hollowed by medication and scarred by a quirk he didn't ask for. Can I ask, do you know how he developed this quirk? The doctor broke Inko out of her thoughts as he again flipped through the manila folder. My files say that your quirk is to pull small objects towards you, is that correct? Yes, Inko announced with a short nod. And his father? His father. His father. Inko's rage roared into life at the very thought of that man wasn't even the right word. There was no word for someone like him. Her grip on her purse grew tighter, though this time out of fury, not anxiety. Her eyes grew hard as she simply, sharply, and with more venom than an angry cobra answered. He breathed fire. The doctor got the message. I see. He quickly closed the file. Well, that does slightly explain the flames, though it could be possible that Izuku's quirk is a mutation. A rare occurrence but not entirely unheard of. He pushed the folder slightly to one side and looked to Inko with a short, professional smile. We'll continue monitoring him and, when the time comes, I believe we should recommend him for quirk counseling. Inko nodded, seeing no reason to disagree despite feeling like every decision about her son was being taken from her own hands. But she knew, inside, that this was going to help him. She had cried herself to sleep enough nights on a chair beside Izuku's bed, watching her child sleep only because she had forced sleeping pills into him. She had been pulled out of work more than once because Izuku had been shrieking about monsters in class, and she had rushed him to the doctors again and again when his quirk had become too much to handle and he had screamed bloody murder from the pain caused by his scars. All while his father did nothing. She felt like the world's greatest failure of a mother, utterly alone and without aid while he did as he pleased, never lifting a finger to help his son. If she ever saw him again. Thank you, Dr. Paranam. Inko announced without meeting his gaze as she stood up and gave the doctor a bow and thanks, who returned it without standing, then she held out a hand to her child. Izuku didn't seem to understand what was happening for a few moments before slow eyes spotted his mother's outstretched palm. He took it with a turtle's grace, only for Inko to suddenly rush him off his feet and into her arms. He was getting just a little big to keep picking up for a woman of her size and frame, but that didn't matter to Inko. No matter how old Izuku got, she would always be there to help her child. The villain hit Izuku with the force of a tidal wave. Instantly the teenager was knocked off his feet, the breath was torn from his lungs and the world span around him as slime, wet and thick and greasy, grabbed his body in a bear hug embrace. The cold, mocking tone of the villain suddenly hit his ears. Don't try and fight, kid, you're fucked. His bag had been thrown from his shoulders, as had his phone, both now laying somewhere on the cold concrete. He knew that because he could feel the ice-cold wetness of the creature across his entire torso, crushing his ribs and pinning his arms to his sides. Instantly panic, hot and raw, set into his mind and body as he began trying to struggle out of the villain's bind. However, he didn't even have time to scream in protest. Tendrils of clammy sludge wrapped themselves around his mouth and nose, and he could feel the insidious creature pushing its horrific body into his nostrils, trying to force its way into his very body. Fear rose inside him like an unchecked wildfire, hammering in his chest and rushing through his limbs, causing him to try and thrash wildly in the kind of horror only the drowned know. A memory flashed before his eyes. A child, tiny and helpless in the arms of a stinking, obese man. His panic went into utter overdrive, drowning out whatever thoughts he had of a rational plan of escape. Now there was only the drive to get out, to fight back, to live. His sobbing reached hysterical levels, aided by the lack of oxygen getting to his acid-filled lungs, and he could hardly see thanks to the blurriness of his vision. Just let it happen. In a few moments you'll be brain dead and I'll be walking in your corpse free and easy. Izuku barely heard the mocking tone of the monster, he could only hear the rushing sound of waves in his ears as his whole body started to lose feeling. His arms were weakening, his legs slowly stopping their fight as the tingling sensation of blood loss began moving through his limbs. Death was creeping over him like a shadow, slow and careful and all-consuming. His eyes drifted closed. Maybe I'll dump your body somewhere public, so your mom can have an open funeral. The thing woke up. His eyes burst open and his body jolted as if struck by lightning. Suddenly his scars were warm, hot, boiling. Izuku's vision was sharpening, colors contrasting, every sense going into overdrive as the thing took more and more of his consciousness, more and more of his body. It was dizzying and maddening. There was something different this time, however, it was reaching deeper into him, drawing out more power than he'd ever felt it summon before. Cold darkness swept over him like a tsunami flood. First his limbs, then his chest, then his brain, then his heart. Hey kid, why ya gettin' so dash? The villain didn't get to finish his sentence because his body was torn in two. Izuku screamed with the sound of a million tortured souls, of madness and fire, of pain and suffering unimaginable. The sound instantly filling the underpass to the point of crushing oppression. The villain was not just thrown from Izuku but practically ripped from him by the sheer force of the awakening power. He hit the wall with enough strength to crack the concrete, the parts large enough of him to do so anyway, bouncing off it and colliding with the floor with a heavy gelatinous slap. The monster reeled in shock and he dizzily cried out, "What the hell is happening?" The air around him was rising, the temperature going from shadow cool to almost boiling. Parts of his body had calcified and hardened from the furnace-like heat emanating from the teenager, and as the sludge villain tried to gather his face back together, he turned his eyes back to the boy who seconds ago had been nothing but a helpless victim. Horror filled him as his eyes beheld the thing. Izuku wasn't sure how long he was out. It could have been minutes, hours, maybe even days. All he knew was that it was the first time in years he had slept without nightmares, without voices whispering terrors to him, without demons crawling at the corners of his vision. He slept. That was all. Dreamless and empty. He wanted to stay there, in the peace and quiet of nothingness. To simply floating forever in the dark. No pain, no sorrow, no thoughts. Just empty oneness with the void. Hey kid, are you alright? Of course, hearing the voice of his idol was a pretty damn tempting pull from the peace of the abyss. As always, the boy jolted right into a waking consciousness with a sharp gasp. Izuku's body ached like it hadn't done in a long time. He felt as though he'd been stretched and pulled in every direction, his muscles feeling as though they were filled with battery acid and his mouth tasted like copper. And yet he wasn't burning. It was odd how the thought seeped into his brain as he groaned in soft pain and flexed his fingers, the cool touch of gravel grounding his senses. Usually, once he'd used his quirk, his body felt like it had been scored by fire, every line of scarring on his body feeling like it was being pressed with a hot poker. This time, however, the only part of his body that really hurt was his mouth, oddly enough. Once his fuzzy vision came into some semblance of focus, they instantly widened. Wow, my god, it's All Might. The first thing he saw was the grin, brilliant and white, then the pointed yellow hair and then the piercing blue eyes. It's often said that people seem smaller from the screen to real life, but Izuku couldn't say that about All Might. If anything, he somehow seemed bigger, taller, stronger and more imposing. Somehow, he just seemed so heroic, and he wasn't even doing anything. He was just standing there, grinning his famous grin with his fists on his hips. His white t-shirt and green cargo pants somehow didn't take from the overall striking power of the man, though it did give him an oddly casual feel. The boy scrambled backward, all aches and pains momentarily forgotten because, holy crap, that's All Might. The giant of a man straightened up, raising a hand in greeting. Ah. Good. You're awake. And by the looks of things you seem fine, thank goodness. I'm afraid I might have, accidentally knocked you out when I showed up. He pointed a thumb over to the manhole from which the sludge villain had first appeared. Well, it wasn't a manhole anymore. Instead it was something of a big gaping wound in the pathway, enough to fit at least 2 full-grown men into. Izuku's eyes widened as he looked around the scene. He had been stood there a minute before, when he had, oh no. Sorry about that. He gave Izuku another quick look over. You must have a pretty powerful quirk to survive that impact though. With a quick glance behind him, Izuku could see a sizable crater now punched into the concrete wall leading into the underpass, and his stomach flipped. Had he really survived that? Shouldn't his back be broken and blood pooling from his head? More and more his stomach was twisting, more and more panic was creeping into his lungs, and he started to breathe rapidly. The thing crawled through his aching limbs, heat snaking down his jagged scars. All Might didn't seem to notice. Heck, by the looks of things you practically beat the villain all on your own. The hero ran a hand through his golden hair and laughed loudly. He was literally begging me to capture him, see? And as if to prove his point, he held up an empty cola bottle which seemed filled with green slime. Another sat empty in a pocket at his side. It wasn't until Izuku saw a pair of eyes drift through it, focus on him, then suddenly vanish again, that he realized what All Might was talking about. His eyes grew wider still and his heart began hammering in his chest. Over and over a single thought rushed through his mind. Did he see the thing? The very idea that his all-time favorite hero had witnessed the thing firsthand almost made him empty his stomach. Instead, he curled himself up into a ball, his face paling more with each second. Dash. He could feel it, the monster within him waking up once more, apparently unsatisfied at its already unprecedented usage in the fight with the villain. His scars, however, warmed slowly, perhaps simply because of his already exhausted state. Izuku's fingers curled into his skin, digging in as much as he dared in front of his idol. Though I'm not sure I fully approve of the burning. All Might's tone became somewhat stern as he looked to the underpass. Izuku glanced out from over folded arms. What he saw caused a cold sweat to break out over his skin. There were fire marks everywhere and charcoaled, almost calcified pieces of sludge which littered the underpass, leading outwards towards the now ruined manhole like a trail of black and green blood. He suddenly realized why the villain had only filled one bottle. Now he emptied his stomach. The moment he did so he felt it, the thing rushing to the surface, threatening to drown out all other senses. Colors around him began sharpening and contrasting. It could still fight, still kill. Whoa there! Maybe you're more shaken up than I thought. All Might's hand was suddenly on his shoulder and Izuku felt as though he had been touched by the sun. Warmth rushed through him and the thing was, quite simply, forced to a halt. One strong hand on his shoulder, one show of kindness, was that all it truly took to stop it from boiling through his scars and into his body? Or perhaps it was simply that the thing was a little more exhausted than it was letting on. The hate, the fury, was still there, Izuku could feel it, but the physical presence of the hero was pushing into retreat. I am sorry. Izuku stammered out as he wiped his mouth on his sleeve before slowly bringing himself unsteadily to his feet. I didn't mean to dash. What's your name, kid? Izuku almost had a heart attack. All Might was asking for his name. Izuku Midoriya. Alright young Midoriya, take some deep breaths and calm down. You've had a tough experience. All Might's tone was surprisingly soft and naturally Izuku followed his advice, feeling just a bit better from doing so, though he kept his eyes fixed firmly on the ground. You acted in self-defense, and besides, the villain will live to see trial and hopefully a jail cell. If anything, I'm willing to bet that you simply need a better handle on your quirk. He didn't know. He couldn't have known. Izuku's anxiety, along with the thing, was calmed but not squashed completely. It lingered deep within him, as it always had. Still, Izuku had so many questions for the hero, so many thoughts he needed to spill from his overloaded heart. He was right here with All Might, this was his golden opportunity. He forced a soft, hopefully friendly smile to his face and turned to look at his hero. Mr. All Might IAGH. Well, I gotta go, kid. All Might wasn't in front of him anymore. He was several steps away stretching his legs and getting ready to jump. How the hell had he done that without Izuku noticing? Then again, Izuku could kick himself for the number of things he missed thanks to the medication in his system. I assume you can get home safely from here. When you do try to lay down and relax, drink some water, watch some TV. Wait, you can't go yet. Izuku cried out as All Might finally finished stretching out. I've so many things to ask you. Sorry, kid, but time waits for no man. And neither does justice. He crouched low, about to leap, and Izuku saw his one chance to ask his burning, heart-wrenching question to his idol about to vanish. Bottling up his fear and anxiety, he shoved all his remaining strength into his voice as he called out, "Can someone become a hero, even if their quirk is evil?" He paused, his arm held out towards All Might, who seemed to freeze in place. Seeing his opportunity widen, he quickly pushed forwards. I've always suffered from the thing I can do. He couldn't force himself to use the term quirk for what he had, it wouldn't be right after all. It's a curse. All it's ever done is cause pain and misery, especially to me. He looked down, his hand curling into a fist on his chest. But I thought, maybe if I become a hero, maybe I can use it for something good. So no one would ever have to be hurt by it anymore. But it's so terrible, I have to know. Please. Can someone like me be a hero like you? His eyes moved back to his idol and his breath caught in his throat, tears welling once more in his eyes. All Might was standing tall, strong, a mountain of strength and power. There was a pause which seemed to stretch on longer than it had any right to before finally the hero looked over his shoulder to the boy. There was something in his opal blue eyes, usually so dark and piercing. A flash of someone else, the person behind the smile. Young Midoriya, listen to me. He half turned to look at Izuku better, and the teenager found himself forgetting to breathe for a moment. There are no such things as good or evil quirks, only good or evil hearts. He held out a massive open palm. What you have is yours, and it is up to you to forge it into something great, something heroic. The mid-afternoon sun cast a light onto the man while consuming Izuku in shadow, and yet, despite their distance, Izuku felt as though he could step out right at that moment and take his side. He could be there, in the light. Tears fell thick and strong down Izuku's cheeks as the weight of All Might's words hit him, though they were not the usual hammer blow of insults he was so used to. This was something else, encouragement, wisdom, words he had needed to hear all his life. A breeze ruffled past them, almost masking the sobs coming from the boy. All Might's fist suddenly clenched tight and his smile widened, not into a grin of humor but one of vast, impossible determination. A bravery which Izuku had only ever dreamed of was right there, right in front of his eyes. Proof that it existed, proof that maybe he could be brave too. The rush of emotion within him was too much, and Izuku fell to his knees as he wept, tears mixed with all the self-hatred he had kept in so long. Cathartic and cleansing they flowed, finally, as the light of true hope reached his core. If you have a heroic heart, then I believe that you too can become a hero. Izuku. The moment he stepped inside the house, his mother was upon him. Inko's hair had grayed in some places where her usual coloring had faded, something that Izuku always somehow felt responsible for. Especially at times like this. She immediately grabbed him by the shoulders and guided him to the living room, where she basically threw him onto the couch and stood over him, fretting and angry and anxious all at once. Where have you been? I was worried sick. M.O. You're not hurt, are you? Was it that Katsuki Bakugo again? Mom, I'll strangle that boy one of these days. Just you wait until his mother Mom! The teenager finally broke his mother's intense, anxious focus and breathed out a slow, long breath. I'm fine, it's fine, just sit down and I'll explain it, okay? Inko did as she was asked and took a chair adjacent to her son, her eyes still fixed intently on him, though she said nothing. And don't freak out, okay? But I was attacked in Attacked? She was back on her feet again within a heartbeat. You were attacked. By who? When? What happened? We need to call the police right now, Mom! Seriously? Izuku had to put both his hands up now, and a weary, but still slightly amused, smile broke out on his face. Please. I'm fine. Sit down and let me explain. Inko sat down again, this time with far more reluctance and with an oddly suspicious frown on her face. I was walking home and just, minding my own business when this, sludge villain came at me. He ran a quivering hand through his messy hair. The memory was still causing his stomach to curl in fear. He had almost died after all, and that wasn't something one got over so quickly. Especially not when he'd had it almost happen before. Was death really that eager for him? Well, knowing the thing, it probably wanted him to die so it could finally crawl back into whatever corner of hell it had come from. Sludge villain? Inko asked cautiously, her hands tightening and untightening in her lap. What did he look like? He was like, big and green and made of sludge. Izuku shrugged weakly. He almost suffocated me. Oh God. Inko's hand rushed to her mouth and her eyes grew wide. Izuku could immediately see what was coming and he quickly pulled the collar of his shirt down. But I'm fine. See? No marks. Just the usual ones, heh. He let his collar go and went back to looking at the coffee table as he recalled the events. Besides, he knew this next part would be the part that frightened her the most. I had to use the thing. The room went cold. The color utterly drained from his mother's face and her mouth hung open just slightly. Izuku could almost hear the breath escape her lungs. He swore that every time he mentioned using the thing his mother aged another year. No wonder she had gray hairs and crow's feet. Finally, she spoke, her voice got achingly quiet. Did anyone get hurt? Well, the villain was pretty messed up, but no one, died I guess. Izuku wished he could curl up into a ball under the gaze of his mother. Secretly, however, part of him hated that look, the one that simply presumed that if he used the thing someone had been terribly hurt, that automatic assumption that he had no control over it whatsoever. What made him hate it the most, however, was that it was true. But I did fight him off, probably scarred him for life. Izuku mumbled off to himself as he looked to one side, his linked fingers tightening against his knuckles. And then. He looked up suddenly to his mother, his eyes lightening up and a grin appearing on his face. Odd how his mother seemed to again frown in suspicion. All Might appeared. And Mom, holy crap Mom, he was amazing. Well, I think he was. I got knocked out but dash. You were knocked out? Izuku, that's really bad for you. Inko was leaning on the arm of the chair now, anxiety and concern written across every inch of her face. Are you sure you're feeling all right? You might be concussed or dash. Mom, really, I'm okay. I think the thing protected me somehow. Anyway, Mom, All Might captured the bad guy and said I did great and just dash. He paused, running a hand suddenly through his messy hair, a slightly wild, shaky smile on his lips. I've never used it like that before. My scars don't even hurt or anything. Though he didn't mention how his entire body still ached, especially his mouth which felt like he'd been punched right in the teeth. He held out a scarred palm and flexed his fingers softly. It had made me feel like I could really get a handle on it, Like, maybe I could really be a hero if I worked hard and dash. Izuku. Inko suddenly stopped him with the tone only a mother could summon. He looked to her, the grin still on his lips though it faded somewhat at his mother's intense, almost clinical stare. Can you smile for me, just for a moment? Izuku blinked at the unexpected request. He watched as his mother got out her phone and held it up, just a quick smile, honey. The teenager paused for a second, wondering where she was going with this, before slowly putting on probably the fakest smile he'd ever had. There was a click of a camera phone and Inko lowered her hand, frowning at the picture she had taken. Izuku was too weirded out to be worried and he craned his neck to try and see the picture. Mom? What are you dash? Look. Inko held her phone out to him. Look what it did to your teeth. His teeth? Izuku took the phone with a shaking hand and frowned at the picture presented to him. Milk pale skin, horrid crossing scars, uncoordinated freckles, under eye bags that were practically designer and long pointed incisor teeth. Nothing out of the AGH. Izuku was up so fast he almost knocked the coffee table over. He rushed to the bathroom, ignoring the shocked calls of his mother as he quickly flicked a light on and leaned over the sink, opening his mouth and pulling his lips up, ignoring the sharp stabs of pain as he did so. There they were. 4 new, long, fawn-like teeth in his mouth. WHAFFHEFUFK? Language. Inko shouted from behind him and Izuku quickly paled from her temper. It didn't help his approaching anxiety attack, however, as he could feel his lungs struggling for air, his mind swimming and a paralyzing panic creeping over his limbs. Thankfully Inko was well versed in such attacks and quickly took his hand, leading him back out the bathroom and over to the couch once more. Sitting him down with a saint's patience, she leaned over a little and began reciting the lines she had long since memorized. Sweetheart, listen to me, breathe in, breathe out, come on now, big breaths. She rubbed his back as Izuku slowly did as he was told. His heart was hammering in his chest, his hands trembling and fidgeting uncontrollably in his lap. The thing stirred, sensing his suffering and crawling through his body like a snake. His scars warmed, though they didn't boil. This wasn't unusual, his curse was all too willing to simply make itself known, to torment him just a little bit further. Breathe in, breathe out. Inko's voice pierced through the haze of panic and slowly but surely he began to get a grip on himself. Inko, noticing this, moved back a step. I'll make you a drink, some tea will help, do you want a Xanax? And no, Mom. Izuku rose to his feet slowly. I think I just need some sleep. But honey dash. Really, Mom? The teenager turned to look at her, giving her a shaking smile. His legs felt like jelly and he was sure if he ate anything he would throw it up. He needed the dark isolation of his room, if only just to finally relax in peace. I am just exhausted, you know? His smile even grew a tiny bit wider. Growing new teeth takes it out of you. A joke. He made a joke. Today really was unusual. Inko seemed torn between letting him go or forcing his ass back on the couch. However, eventually she relented and gave a nod. All right, go get some rest. If you need me I'll be right here, okay? She raised a hand to her son's cheek and returned his weak smile, no doubt a Midoriya trait. I love you, son. Whatever happens. Love you too, Mom. Izuku gave her a small nod and on shaking legs he vanished into his bedroom. The moment he was alone in the dark he stripped himself of sweaty, dirty clothes and pulled on some pajama pants, then he crawled into his bed and curled up under the warm all-night covers. Exhaustion conquered worry and Izuku quickly drifted into sleep. His mother had demanded he take the next day off and Izuku hadn't argued. Once Inko had called in sick for him she had left for work with strict orders of bed rest and relaxation. Again, Izuku didn't argue, if anything he agreed. He had just beaten his first villain, well kind of, and it had been far more of an emotional and physical roller coaster than he ever thought it would be. How did All Might make it seem so easy? Then again, All Might didn't have a demon crawling through his body waiting to tear people apart at the slightest provocation. The next few days droned by, only broken by one quickly booked trip to the dentist who cleared Izuku of any harm, though both son and mother had avoided questions as to what had happened to cause his odd new growths. Even so, despite the days quickly settling back to a sense of normalcy there was something different about the young man. Izuku was no longer drifting through each day, now he spent each and every hour thinking over what had happened, the events of his almost death being overanalyzed in his head to an obsessive degree. It was still difficult for him to keep focus of course, the medication continued to grind his senses into the dirt, but now he had a reason to lift his head. Now he had a fire lit under him that no medication could suppress. By the time the weekend rolled around Izuku had something he hadn't had in years. Drive. His tongue poked at his new fangs as the sea breeze rustled his hair and Izuku listened to the peaceful sound of waves lapping on sand until it splashed against rusting metal. It used to be a beach, though these days it was more like an old junkyard. Old refrigerators, TVs, rotting wood cabinets, even some cars littered the shore. The smell was terrible, though Izuku had long since learned to simply get used to it. There wasn't much he could do to stop it after all. He had heard people complain about it before. An eyesore that really the local government or some hero agency should do something about, and what were they paying their taxes for if they couldn't even clean it all up? To Izuku it was a haven. Katsuki never came here. No one ever came here. It was broken and ruined, and Izuku, despite the eye-rolling nature of it, somewhat felt a kinship with it all. Why not? It was here, amongst the discarded and fallen, that he found peace. He was just another broken thing amongst all the other broken things. He was sat in his favorite spot, part of an old truck cab that had somehow found its way on the top of a small mountain of trash. It never got wet enough to become soggy, and the seat was still comfortable enough. He could sit for hours and listen to podcasts or simply watch life crawl by. Sometimes he even saw demons and monsters moving through the ocean waves, vast and incredible. Oddly, they never did seem to bother him here. His tired eyes looked to his open palm, and for a moment they traced the lines of burn scars that wove their way over his skin. Monday had taught him a lesson. He had to learn how to use the thing. Not push it down, not ignore it, actually learn to use it. Right. Use it. No problem. Had he ever willingly activated it? The very realization was such a shock that he almost slipped out of the cab. Did he even know how to switch the damn thing on? Another long moment of looking to his scarred hands, and he came to the heavy decision that he would never know until he tried. How did the old saying go? Curiosity killed the cat. He gulped and forced his anxiety down, or at least shoved it inside some inner bottle where it could sit until it bubbled over and flooded into his head once more. Izuku took a moment to take out his phone and text his mother, telling her he was fine and would be home in a while. She had been far more cautious about him lately, far more watchful. Izuku almost felt like she thought he was doing drugs or something. It was even becoming a little oppressive, though he knew she was just looking out for him after such a volatile start to the week. After shoving his phone into his pocket, Izuku crawled over a number of old appliances and ruined pieces of furniture before finally arriving in a small opening that afforded him just enough space to move while making sure no one could easily spot him. Once he was absolutely sure no one was around, he removed his hoodie and gave a quick stretch. He was wearing sweatpants, trainers, and an old t-shirt, figuring that for practice he needed to keep his clothes simple and loose. He had spent the last 9, almost 10 years suppressing the thing without even considering the thought of ever using it properly, simply acting on some vague assumption that UA would solve all those problems for him. Now, however, he knew he had a lot of catching up to do if he was even going to make it into UA, and, as All Might had mentioned, time waited for no one. Alright, let's do this. Izuku breathed to himself as he shook his hands and hopped up and down in the center of the opening in some mild, amateurish attempt to warm himself up. His stomach was flipping and his whole body seemed shaky and weak, and voice in his head kept telling him to go back, give up, do it tomorrow. He silenced it with a deepening frown and gathered his courage. He could do this, he knew he could, one step at a time. Okay, nice and easy, I'll just summon it to my arms and, yeah. Izuku took a slow, deep breath, gulped, then threw his hand out and shouted, activate. There was, of course, nothing. Hell, it didn't even stir within him. If anything, Izuku was sure he could hear a distant laughter, though that might have just been his schizophrenia acting up. Frowning to himself, he gathered his already shaky confidence and tried again, this time widening his stance and trying to will the thing to emerge. Activate. A breeze blew through the open car windows, somewhere a seagull cackled, an insect buzzed by him. Are you kidding me? Izuku threw the insult out like an angry child and kicked a piece of trash out of his path as he ranted. All my life, all my fucking life, you've tormented me, and now the one time I actually try to use you and you don't fucking work. What kind of stupid ass thing are you? The thing didn't reply. Ugh. Izuku sat down on the bonnet of a ruined car and sulked. He had never been this disappointed to not feel the hot rush of burning power along his scars. What was he doing wrong? His tongue once again poked at his fangs as he thought on just why this wasn't working. The answer, of course, was obvious. He wasn't in any actual danger. Every other time the thing had sprung into action, he had felt like he was about to be hurt or worse. However, right now he wasn't willing to go wandering into some crime-ridden drug den just to ask nicely if one of the meth heads could come at him with a knife. You know, just to see if he could get his horrifying, hellborn curse to activate. Oh, and it might just slaughter everyone there, no big deal though. He had to think of something solid, something he could use here and now and, supposedly, in any future situation. Izuku breathed deep and focused as much as he could on the issue, willing his foggy brain to do some actual work for once. His mind wandered to the events of Monday, the feeling of the slime around his mouth, the burning of his lungs, the death that had been tugging at his heart. Anxiety shot through him and his scars heated up. He quickly looked to his arms. Was that it? Was that the key to using it? Every time he wanted to activate the thing he would just have to picture himself almost dying? Oh God, would that even make it worth it? For a moment he looked to the burned, jagged lines of skin on his arms with his eyes wide before wrapping them around himself. Well, if this is what it takes to be a hero. He stood up, this time with renewed determination on his face which manifested as an incredibly unsure smile. Walking back to the center of the opening he stood silently, arms at his sides and his eyes closed. Taking one last deep breath he let his mind drift back to the sludge monster, to the threat of imminent death, to all the horror and fear that had come with it. The power rippled through his body and air around him grew hotter, supercharged with the raw infernal power of the boy's quirk. He could feel it, like furious lava flowing along his scars. Desperately Izuku reached out to grab more of it, anything that he could, almost demanding the thing to rush through his system. This time, however, he was prepared, or rather as prepared as his razor-thin nerves would allow him to be. He felt the boiling shadow of the thing's power flood into his arms, and the second it did so he threw his palms forward, summoning everything he had to focus on forcing the thing outward. Incredibly, it obeyed. For a split second, he could feel it. The thing reshaping his muscle, skin, and bone with white-hot fury as it rushed through his arms. Just for a split second. Then the world around him exploded as blue fire erupted from what was now his palms with an ear-splitting boom. The force was so sudden and so great that it threw him backward and within half a heartbeat his back collided with the side of an old refrigerator. Izuku bounced off it with a yelp of pain and landed onto the floor in a collapsed heap. The world span and he could feel his entire body burning with the force of the thing's activation, though it was a creeping, stinging heat, not the boiling, oppressive fire that he was so used to. One eye opened slowly and before him he could see the black stain that blanketed his arm up to his elbow. A leathery hand now ending in talon-like claws that remolded and reshaped back into the hand he knew was his own, the shadow that had coated him simply flaking away like ash in the wind. He fought off the urge to throw up and slowly pulled himself into a sitting position, falling back against the refrigerator and panting heavily. He should have brought some water, he should have laid out some mattresses, he should have. Izuku's eyes widened. What had once been a small hill of discarded trash was now nothing more than a smoking hole. Pockets of blue flame licked away at whatever was flammable, gradually dying in the strong breeze which now rushed through the opening. He had done that. All of that. With one blast. Izuku looked at his shaking hands, his entire body sore as he took gulping breaths, knowing that he'd probably bruised all his back and would ache for weeks. But even so. I did it. His voice was barely a whisper above the sound of licking flame and roaring wave, but even so, a big, wobbling, toothy grin broke out on his face and tears began flowing down his cheeks. I did it. It took several minutes of relieved sobbing before the teenager finally came to his senses, the warmth that had flooded across his scars slowly fading away as he did so. He patted himself down gingerly, looking for any new sudden growths on his person and, thankfully, finding none. Cautiously, with a lot of wincing and hissing through clenched teeth, he picked himself up and began moving towards the exit. This was enough for one day, but he knew the moment he stopped feeling like deep-fried garbage he would be back to try again. And again, and again. As he walked, his step weaving just a little as his mind sluggishly considered what he'd just done. His body wasn't strong enough, he knew that at the very least. He couldn't go into the exam being able to fire once and be done. That would certainly result in a fail. He would have to train himself, make his body stronger so that he could handle the thing better. As for the thing, he looked again to one hand which had for a second had released blue fire with the force of a missile and, just for a moment, he could almost see the monstrous, black leather skin and scythe-like claws that it had become. He closed his hand and sighed. Maybe he could just contain it to his hands for now, everything else could come afterward. One step at a time. You've been working so hard lately, I'm so proud of you, Inko announced as she fiddled around with the collar of his uniform. You're going to do great, I know it. Thanks Mom. Izuku mumbled as he let her fidget. He knew she was nervous and she was simply doing all of this to calm her own sense of anxiety, but it wasn't helping him, and right now he needed to hang on to all the confidence he could muster. Look, I've got to go. Okay, I know, but just let me make sure you're all set before you leave, okay? Mom, Do you have your pens and pencils? What about your lunch? You took your medicine this morning, right? Let me just double dash. Mom! Izuku pulled away from her suddenly and with more force than he intended. A sudden coldness came between them as Inko stared wide-eyed at her son, but Izuku quickly closed the gap and put a hand on his mother's anxious shoulder. A grin, small and shaking, but somehow still laced with a shadow of confidence, appeared on his lips as he simply said, I'm fine, don't worry about me, okay? For a split second, Inko could see him. The smile of his father. Each day Izuku was growing up and turning into a man before her eyes, which meant each day he was becoming just a little more like him. And it was starting with that fanged smile. With all her heart she hoped, though she didn't believe, that was where it would end. Sighing softly, she pushed her anxiety into the pit of her stomach and pulled her son into a swift embrace. Good luck today, Izuku. You can do this. I love you, son. Izuku returned her hug for just that moment. Love you too, Mom. He pulled away again, though this time it was at least amicable, and opened the door. But I've really got to go, so I'll call you when it's done, okay? Text me when you get on and off the train and when you get there. I will, CYA later. Izuku was already out the door and into the frosty autumn air by the time he even agreed. Inko watched him go, standing on her doorstep with her hands pulled up to her chest. Her son, her poor Izuku, she was so proud of how far he had come. And she knew he still had great things ahead of him. The train ride was tedious to say the least. From the moment he sat down it started. Whispers filtering in from around him, vague insults that mostly meant nothing as his eyes flicked around the carriage. He did his best to ignore them, turning up the volume of his phone as loud as he felt he could get away with. At one point he was even sure he had seen something slither under the seat of a man sitting across from him. Izuku, however, shook it off and focused his gaze on his phone. It had been getting more and more obvious over the past few months, and it was starting to trouble him. The more he used the thing, the less effective his medication was getting. It was something he hadn't mentioned to his mother. He didn't see the need to. All she would do was worry further and send him back to the psychologists, who would either double his dosage or switch it to something else. He couldn't afford to go through that, not when he was about to step foot onto the hallowed grounds of UA in his one big shot at shaping his entire future. Of course, all thoughts of whispers and demons halted when he actually got there. He was too in awe before the vast imposing building of glimmering reflected sunlight that was UA. For a second he simply stood, mouth agape and hands on the straps of his backpack as he marveled at his dream come true. He was here, right at UA itself. He marveled as he passed the busts of famous heroes etched into marble, his mouth widening into a toothy, enthralled grin. He was walking amongst heroes, where All Might himself had trained, where? Whumph! Without paying a lick of attention he collided right into someone's side. The moment he did so he staggered back, panic rushing through his system and his scars warming up in response. He bowed several times in a rushed apology and stammered out, I am so sorry. His hand shot up in whatever passed as a pathetic defense as he looked up. He was tall, the person he'd walked into, and probably rather strong since they seemed to have barely nudged at all. Familiar. That was the first thing that crossed Izuku's mind as he looked up at the man he'd stupidly walked into. The next was that he looked like a business manager, especially with his flowing charcoal black coat, fog gray suit and a plain black tie with a single emblazoned sign that was half hidden by his waistcoat. His hair was also black, combed up and back away from his face with just enough loose hairs to hint at its untamable nature. His face seemed almost plain, with a narrow chin and nose, and with a very light morning stubble to it. But it was his eyes, windowed by a pair of no-rim spectacles, which immediately stopped Izuku's stammering. Black. All black. Except for a pair of simmering dark yet light blue pupils. Izuku was struck with the thought of All Might's powerful, righteous gaze, but it wasn't quite the same. There was nothing righteous about that gaze. There was power, yes, but nothing righteous. The businessman had been holding his phone in a leather-gloved palm when Izuku had walked into him, and his finger hovered over it as he turned to the young man. For a second time seemed to freeze, and Izuku was sure he was about to be chewed out by a busy CEO, and internally he braced himself. The man simply chuckled. No harm caused, son, just watch where you're going in the future, yes? His voice was smooth and charming, almost devilishly so. A kind of voice suited to boardrooms and corporate lawyers. Izuku, oddly, felt his anxiety calm at the man's tone. Why yes, sir, thank you. He darted past him, however, he had barely gone 2 steps before the man spoke again. Did I say we were finished? Izuku froze and turned slowly back to the man. His voice had suddenly been laced with such authority that he couldn't help but stop dead in his tracks. Again, Izuku felt his scars flare with heat, and yet, the thing whispered no curses into his head. In fact, it remained oddly silent. The man walked to the shaking boy and stood before him. Again, Izuku felt as though it was only the thin layer of glass from the man's spectacled gaze that allowed him to look up to those eyes which seemed so pitiless and cold and yet full of pride and fire. Young man, are you here to take the entrance exam? Why yes, sir. Then stand taller. Have some confidence, why don't you? He raised a fist up suddenly and a smile grew on his lips. Pride in yourself is the first step on the road to victory. The teenager didn't know how to respond, he simply stood and blinked up at the strange man. Dash. Come on now, shoulders straight, chest out, chin up. He flicked a hand at the boy and the smile continued to dance on his lips. Let's see it. Izuku wondered if he should just outright run. Strange people giving him instructions on the day of his exam wasn't exactly the best indication of how the day would go. But even so, all the man was doing was being friendly, and he supposed the advice wasn't exactly terrible. The teenager did as he was told, taking a shuddering breath before straightening up and gripping his fists at his side. Weirdly, he actually did feel better. Maybe he could do this. Maybe he could get into UA. Ha! See? Now you look ready for anything, young man. He strode past Izuku, slapping a strong hand onto his shoulder as he passed him. Pass the exam, son, and perhaps we'll see one another again in the future. Izuku turned and watched as the man walked away from him, wondering just what he meant by that. He looked like no hero he had ever seen, though it was possible he was simply out of uniform or that UA hired teachers who weren't heroes. Still, the more he thought about it he was so sure he'd seen the man somewhere before. It was right on the edge of his tongue. The exam. Whoa. Right. Izuku jumped suddenly back into action, rushing off towards the main entrance, all thoughts of anything but exams and his future banished from his mind. Izuku felt sick. He had prepared for a physical exam. He had prepared enough that he was sure he could pass if he could focus hard enough when the time came. He had even prepared his clothes, making sure he wore loose jogging pants and an old t-shirt. He hadn't prepared for a mass competition. There had to be about 20, maybe 30 people around him as they stood outside the huge, vast doors that seemed to open up to what looked to be a slice of a city. And he had to perform in front of all of them. He had to use the thing in front of 30 people, while cameras watched and recorded him. The thought had crossed his mind that this had the very slight potential of becoming an absolute massacre. No, he wouldn't let that happen. He had to keep focused, that was the key here. Discipline and focus. If he couldn't keep his head he could blow all of this before it had even begun. He was half sure he had passed the written exam, at least he seriously hoped he had, but this was different. This was where it all truly mattered. His objectives were simple: fight the robots, gain the points, win a spot in UA. Something moved through the crowd, instantly shattering Izuku's focus and drawing his eye. Something the size of a dog made entirely of withered arms, rotten meat and teeth was scraping itself along the floor, snaking unnaturally between people who seemed blissfully ignorant of its presence. Izuku's stomach went cold as he forced a gulp and tried to keep his feet from turning and running. It was just a small episode, nothing big, nothing to break his focus over. It wasn't real, it wasn't real, it wasn't. He hadn't realized he was moving backwards slowly until he was stopped by a firm hand on his shoulder. He turned and instantly his heart sank into his stomach. The teenager, who kind of resembled a grown man, was a giant to Izuku. Thin glasses framed his square face and the jumpsuit he wore made no secret of his toned physique. However, Izuku already knew of him because he'd been reprimanded by him during their original prep talk in the main hall. It hadn't been his fault though. He'd spotted a fist-sized spider-like creature with the face of a screaming man moving up towards his desk and had yelped at the sight. Everyone had laughed. The giant had told him off and he had almost died right there of embarrassment. "Are you paying attention to where you're going?" His tone was so smart, so stern, Izuku felt like he was being lectured by a teacher. "You almost walked into me while I was stretching. You need to watch yourself, unless of course, you're not taking these exams seriously." "Oh." Izuku almost jumped at the accusation. "No, that's not it at all, I just dash." Obsessive, prideful fool. This is a very serious school with a very serious reputation. The taller boy's arms moved in an almost robotic fashion as he lectured Izuku, who did his best to ignore the whisper that sounded like a guttural, primal growl crawling at the insides of his brain. "If you are not prepared to focus in these exams, then you should simply quit now before dash." "Alright, go." The tone was so loud that Izuku felt the ground rumble under him. He spun in shock and looked up where the tiny figure of Present Mike was standing, all hair and black leather and tinted sunglasses. Izuku blinked up at him for a moment before looking around, wondering if he was addressing someone else. Except there was no one else, it was just him, while the rest of the entire group sped off into the now open doors of the city. "Run!" "Shit!" Izuku immediately turned and sprinted after the others as fast as his legs would carry him. Already heat was ghosting across his scars, pushing the boy onwards with greater urgency. For all his training and attempts to conquer the thing he knew at best, he had about 2, maybe 3 shots within him before he would be too weak to continue. His plan, therefore, was to focus on high-level targets, or groups of robots together, and hope that he could simply turn them into giant, smoking piles of scrap metal in time. Of course, first he had to actually find a robot to fight, and already he was behind everyone else. Alright, think. Izuku muttered to himself as he approached a wide crossroads in the center of the city. If I was a robot, where would I dash? There was a rumble ahead of him, and as he skidded to a halt, a huge, green, metal machine rolled out in front of him. Izuku felt the strength almost completely leave his limbs as he looked up in terror at the robotic monster. His scars, however, suddenly heated up in response, and as the bite of fire hit him, his brain kicked back into gear. He threw out his arm. All he needed was to focus, and the robot exploded, and it wasn't his doing. He blinked in shock, the sharp bite of the dissipating heat not nearly enough to overwhelm his senses as he looked around to spot a young, thin, effeminate-looking man standing with his hands behind his head and a dissipating beam of sparkling light fading from his stomach. "Ah, thank you for the distraction, Mon Ami. We make a great team. Shame we'll never meet again." And with that he was off, running down the opposite street. Izuku blinked. Was I just saved by a Frenchman? Pompous, self-centered coward. Shush. Izuku hissed to himself as he took off running again. He had found himself talking back more lately, though it didn't do any good. The thing would hiss in his ear regardless if he responded or not. At least he wasn't seeing any more hallucinations. That really would be the worst thing right now, firing blasts off at things that weren't even there. 5 minutes. Present Mix's voice rang out over the arena, and Izuku felt the sharp stab of panic once more. He was losing time and losing focus. Every corner he turned he saw more smoking slabs of metal, more ruined robots, and not a single one he could defeat himself. He had been so worried about not having the energy to gain enough points, but at this rate he wouldn't even have any points no matter what he did. What the hell? The panic was gripping him now, crawling up his arms and digging its claws deep into his brain. Heat was moving like waves along his scars, responding to his growing fear. Why can't I find any robots? Surely there's got to be something around here to dash. The explosion rocked the Faux City like an earthquake, and Izuku, along with the two other people he currently shared the street with, were almost thrown off their feet. He turned his eyes to the source of the sound, and all color, if there was any color to begin with, drained from Izuku's face. A 0-pointer. The screen back in the main hall had made it seem no bigger than 2 stories, max. The robot was so large it almost blotted out the sun. Its upper shoulders grazed the tops of buildings at least 20 stories high, its monstrous wheels, which ground the earth so loudly Izuku could hear it crushing concrete and asphalt even from a distance, swallowed up an entire 4-lane street including the pavements. It raised a clawed hand and instantly demolished a building that could have housed an entire shopping mall. People were already running. Some were even screaming. Somewhere above the din of the machine present Mick's voice rang out, 2 minutes. Flee. Izuku's legs moved, stiffly, to set him on course with everyone else. There was no beating something like that, surely, and even so it was 0 points so. Help! The voice cut through everything else. Through the sound of steel crushing stone, through the crashing of rooftop onto pavement, through the haze of static that surrounded Izuku's mind like a light fog. The sound of a girl screaming in pain, in panic, in fear. Izuku's eyes spotted her, a brown bob visible through the growing cloud of dust in the street before him. She had been trapped under a vast slab of stone, and all the while the vast, monstrous tracks of the 4-pointer moved towards her. His legs began to move. Fuck. His voice bounced in his mind as he sped towards her, his legs feeling like they were being filled with battery acid and his heart almost exploding in his chest. Boiling heat raced across his scars, fueling his actions, pain and fire biting at his every limb. His senses sharpened into overdrive, colors brightening and edges contrasting, the sound of the machine roaring in his ears and the feel of his own blood pounding in his brain. But he didn't stop, he didn't slow down. Every instinct he had was telling him one thing over and over, save that girl. He didn't notice the taller boy in blue pass him, nor did he notice the look of shock he was given before he carried on. Before he knew it, he was by her side and instantly he tried to grab her, to pull her arm, to get her out. She screamed at him as he did so, he was too rough, too panicked and the slab too heavy. Words reached his ears, save yourself. Go! Wide green eyes stared at her, then they looked to the unstoppable force of metal grinding ever on towards them. We can stop the construct, 10,000 hissing voices forged into one screamed into his ears and only his ears. We are shadow and flame, unleash our fury. He knew what he had to do. Close your eyes. He called out to her as he let go of her and walked into the center of the street. Don't look, whatever you do, don't look. Izuku felt it. The flood of power, dark and terrible, rushing through his limbs, overflowing from his furnace-hot scars. What are you? Izuku's eyes turned to her and the color drained from her face. What's wrong with Dash? Close your eyes. His voice echoed with more than his own and the girl did as she was told, terror beyond being crushed now gripping her. The familiar feeling of drowning was overtaking him and he could feel his hands, his feet, his body reshaping from the fire inside him. Every thought, every piece of focus he had however was not on control, not on sticking out his arms and hoping for the best. It was on a single objective, a thought he hoped against all hope that the thing would obey. Kill that machine. The thing grinned with Izuku's lips. Uraraka's eyes were screwed tight but she could still feel, still hear. The fire heat that washed over her face was something she hadn't expected, neither was the sudden sound of wings beating once and only once. There was a second where she heard only the sound of the vast 0-pointer moving closer, ever closer, then. There was a scream that sent claws of fear digging into her very soul. A scream that was so terrible to hear that every part of her mind suddenly felt like it was drenched in black mourning and fathomless dread. Then the world shattered. A bomb-like explosion went off above her and everything lifted into the air, throwing her, the slab that had trapped her and the window of every building in the street flying backward. It was a cacophony of noise, of shattering glass and screaming metal. Fire washed over her skin and she could feel 1,000 new bruises form as rubble pelted her body. Her back collided with something solid and she realized, with a sharp pain, that she had hit the side of a building. Uraraka landed onto the pavement in a heap of dust and shattered glass, the cuts already biting through her clothes and skin. But the boy. The boy. She looked up and for a moment all she saw was a cloud of blue fire, ash, metal and absolute devastation. What had once been the monster machine's face was now nothing but open air filled with flaming, falling debris. What had once been its entire body was a cavernous hole of wire and oil and fire and smoke. Then she saw something new. At first she wasn't sure what she saw. It seemed to be nothing but a shadow against the sky, something sharp and dark, wrapped by what she swore were leathery wings. But then, as it fell, all of that was revealed to just be a blanket of crumbling black ash. It was the boy. And he was falling. He was falling fast. She moved. Her back felt broken, her limbs felt shattered and everything in her body was screaming, "Sit down, Uraraka, you stupid bitch." But she moved. Her timing had to be perfect, her aim had to be perfect, or the falling boy bleeding ash and smoke would be dead the moment he hit the pavement. She ran, one foot landing on a fallen piece of machinery, and she leapt at the last possible moment, swinging her hand just in time to slap the boy across the face. He stopped falling. Uraraka hit the ground in a crumpled scream and rolled, knowing now for certain something inside her was broken. But he stopped falling. She curled into a ball for just a moment, fighting the urge to scream, to cry, to throw up. Finally, however, her eyes opened and there he was. The boy. The boy with the unkempt hair and pale skin and the bags under his eyes. The boy with the scars that she dared not ask about. He floated lightly in midair like a feather caught in a breeze. His t-shirt was ruined, torn and burned beyond repair. His shoes were missing too, having at some point simply been torn or perhaps disintegrated from his feet as his sweatpants seemed burned up to his shins. His eyes opened slowly and, against everything that had just happened, he smiled. No, he grinned at her, and for the first time she noticed his teeth. Izuku grinned at her. He didn't know quite why. Maybe it was because he'd been knocked stupid by his own power. Maybe it was because his body felt like it was about to crumble apart. Or maybe it was because somewhere inside him he knew that's what a hero did when they looked utterly broken. Are you okay? It was the first thing he could think to ask. His mouth tasted like ash and his throat burned, but he had to ask, he had to know. His body was howling at him, not just from the pain of his scars, though that was indeed part of it, but from the sheer force of energy he had spent to do all of that. He had trained to fire 3 shots, maximum. He had just demolished something that could have torn through downtown in a minute. Even the thing seemed exhausted, the usual bubbling, churning growls of black hate nothing but a whimper inside him. The girl nodded at him, then she said something unexpected. Sorry. He blinked slowly at her. Sorry? For this. Her fingertips came together and gravity gripped him with a jealous hand. He dropped like a sack of old potatoes and landed with a concentrated scream of pain onto the floor. His fingers and toes felt numb, but the scars across them pulsed with a residual burning heat that reminded him that, yes, he was still alive and, yes, he was an idiot. But the girl was safe. She was throwing up on the floor, but that was fine, it was all fine. She was safe. Ache and pain tore through him as he raised an arm and slammed it down on the ground, and by sheer force of will he began dragging himself forward. His teeth gritting together as he refocused whatever strength was left within him on getting back to the task at hand. His voice was weak and breaking, but even so he hissed out, I just need 1 point, just one and dash. And time. Thanks for playing, callers. He thought he didn't have the energy to feel upset, and yet somehow tears still formed at his eyes. It was there, in the back of his mind, selfishly nagging at him despite everything he had done. It was over, all of it. His one chance at becoming someone, was over. Exhausted, ruined, and devastated, Izuku wept. It had been a difficult week for Izuku. Coming home and explaining to his mother that he had burnt his dreams to a crisp because he had thrown himself at a giant robot to save a girl had been hard, far harder than he'd imagined it'd be. It had been especially tough to hear his mother curse UA's name for just wanting violent thugs and not heroes. She had assured him, over and over, that his actions would count for something, they had been heroic after all. At one point Izuku had literally been forced to place himself between her and her phone to make sure she didn't call them and scream them out on his behalf. Izuku knew that results were results. 0 points were 0 points no matter how one looked at it. It didn't help that as the week went on he had to suffer through Katsuki's constant bragging. Somehow word had gotten out about his 0 points and the ridicule had reached epic proportions. More than once Izuku had been forced to stop the rage of the thing from melting the skin from Katsuki's grinning, mocking face. Those times, of course, meant that his scars had erupted with fire-burning pain, causing even more mockery. Yeah, it had been a week to say the least. We can kill him. The thing tempted, snake-like along his skull for the 100th time that week, our blood is dash. We can shut up. Izuku grumbled as he approached the steps to his home. He was getting increasingly sick of the thing's attitude lately. It was concerning him that it seemed to no longer just be content with a handful of words, it was forming full sentences now. He knew it was a consequence of his training and couldn't be helped, but it did make ignoring it a hell of a lot harder. He opened his front door with a sigh, wondering just how he would tell his mother that he needed to up his medication again. However, he didn't even get the chance to mention it. The second the door was open, Inko was upon him. Izuku! The teenager jumped in shock as his mother shoved something at his chest, her eyes filled with anxious tears. It's here! Destiny calls us. The boy hid a wince as the hiss within his skull, instead focusing his eyes down to the object his mother had practically assaulted him with. It was a letter, with the seal of UA stamped to the back. He took it from her with a shaking hand, his eyes growing wide. Open it. Inko quickly insisted. Come on, I want to see your face when you get accepted. Izuku stammered for a moment before gripping the letter tightly. I'm going to my room. Inko's face fell. But dash. Please, Mom. Let me do this alone, okay? And without looking at her he pushed past his mother, storming towards his room before his heart could be caught in his throat. He didn't want her to see him cry when his dreams finally fell apart. The murky darkness of his room was welcoming. Odd how he always felt better in dark places. The voices came in clearer and louder in dark, and the thing was always more willing to make itself known at night, but Izuku couldn't help but feel like the shadow offered some kind of comfort to him. It was harder to see how damaged he was when he could barely see his own hands. Besides, lights didn't seem to like him anyway, any strong emotion caused them to flicker and fail. Making his way to his computer desk he sat down and laid the envelope flat out before him. For a long moment he wondered if he should even bother opening it. He knew he had failed, he should just throw it in the trash now, right? Katsuki's laughing, mocking face drifted into his thoughts and he found himself scowling. His self-loathing suddenly turned to irritation, and then quickly to anger. His scars flared and as if snapping into action he reached forward and tore the letter open with a grunt of deep-seated frustration. Out popped an odd silver ashtray-like disc that clattered onto his desktop and then a second later lit up with activation. I am here as a projection. The sudden bright light and loud shouting almost blinded the boy and he scrambled backward, nearly falling out of his desk chair. The huge face of All Might grinned down at him from the projection and suddenly pulled back. The scene was a colorful one, all flashing stripes, bright gold and red drapes framing the huge form of the man who seemed to be dressed in what Izuku first thought was a banana suit but quickly realized it was his vintage interview suit from countless TV appearances. Almost instantly there was a growling, blood and bone-soaked whisper that scraped through his brain. The Fading King. Izuku, however, ignored it, the very shock of seeing his hero pushing all other thoughts aside. You're probably wondering why I am presenting this video. Well, let me announce to you that I, All Might, will be teaching at UA this year as part of the hero course. Izuku winced as just how loud he announced his own name, yet even so he couldn't hide how incredibly giddy it was making him to have All Might talk right to him. He wasn't technically talking to him, of course, but it's still pretty cool. It was also interesting to learn that he would be teaching. How lucky for the students who would get onto the course. Not that he would ever be there to see in person. Now, let me see here. He held up a piece of paper and Izuku could almost see the cogs in his mind working. You are Izuku Midoriya. Izuku's heart lit up as his hero spoke his name, and even more so when the giant of a man clearly seemed to recognize him. Wait, that rings a bell, didn't I what? He looked to one side. What do you mean wrap it up? I write, but alright, fine. He sighed loudly. Anyway, congratulations on passing the written exam, good on you. However, in the practical you scored 0 points. Sorry about that. Izuku felt like gravity was gripping him tighter than it ever had done. He could almost feel his body sink down into his chair and begin the process of collapsing onto the floor. His heart tore as he heard the words spoken by his hero. 0 points. There it was, in banana yellow, clear as day. That is, of course, a fail, if that's all we were counting on. Gravity stopped working. Izuku shot up in his chair and his hands gripped his pants tightly. Ha! All Might put his giant fists onto his hips. Bet that woke you up. Now, check out this video. TADAAA. From within his suit he whipped out a remote and the camera panned to one side, showing a giant TV screen. With a click it came to life and there she was. The girl with the brown bob hair, the girl he had saved from the zero-pointer, dressed in her school uniform approaching President Mike, unmistakable in his black leather and pointing hair. Hey, Mr. President Mike? Sir? Do you remember a boy? He had curly green hair and, scars, and she made a cross across her face with a finger, causing Izuku to wince and feel suddenly very self-conscious. Well, in the exam, I heard him say he didn't have any points but he saved me from that big zero-pointer. Izuku felt something inside him. Something he wasn't sure if he'd ever felt before. Something warm and good. Something that made him straighten up just a little more and raise his chin just slightly. Something that sent a tingle of heat along his scars that didn't seem to hurt. Pride. He felt pride. Well, I think he should have some of my points. If he didn't stop to save me he could have. It's unfair that he should do that and still get nothing, you know? She bowed suddenly to the DJ and, in a shaking voice, loudly asked, Please, let me give him some of my points, please. President Mike chuckled and patted the girl on the head. I'm sorry, female caller, but you can't pass your points to anyone else. Don't worry about that kid though, we saw it all and trust me, he's fine. Izuku's jaw hung open. No one other than his mother had ever been that kind to him. No one had ever stuck their neck out like that, no one had ever shown him such sympathy. He was shaking and tears were forming at his eyes as he watched the camera pan back to refocus on All Might, who had apparently been standing and watching the entire time. The other teachers told me that it's been a long time since anyone has done that after an entrance exam. It's a sign that you not only used your quirk and sacrifice of yourself, but you spurred another to do something kind in return. All Might turned back to the camera, his ever-present grin no longer humorous and friendly, but something different, something determined and strong and powerful. And believe me, they took notice. You see, it's not simply raw, destructive power that gains you points in the exam. Being a hero isn't all about beating up bad guys, you know. It's about saving lives while risking your own, doing whatever it takes to make sure others are safe. That's why we have, and he paused for dramatic effect, rescue points. He thrust a finger into the air where the camera panned up to reveal a giant scoreboard. Right there in neon green read his name and then villain points, 0, rescue points, 60. Tears fell from Izuku's eyes, though this time they were no longer of fear, terror and self-hatred. They were hot and heavy and joyful. His body was almost bursting from the emotions he felt now like a typhoon inside his heart. unfamiliar burning pride, alien joy and the brightest, hottest and most pleasantly painful of all, hope. His fingers gripped the desk so tightly they went white and his scars tingled sharply with the heat of roiling power. But Izuku didn't care. All he could think about was the screen before him and the iron grin of imposing purpose on All Might's face as he reached out towards the camera. Izuku Midoriya. You passed the exam. Izuku was on his feet though he couldn't remember when it had happened. The emotion in his chest was almost overwhelming, every color around him seemed sharper, every noise seemed louder but he didn't care. He didn't care because it didn't matter, all that mattered was this moment, right here, right now. All that mattered was that his dream wasn't dead. So I welcome you, young Midoriya. From this moment forward, you are officially a student at UA High. His scream was so loud that Inko burst into the room from her pacing outside, expecting the worst but pausing when she saw her son. In the dim light it was clear, his scars glowing softly with that terrible inner furnace he was cursed with, and yet when he turned to her she felt no horror, despite his clenched fists and bared teeth. Because she had never seen him stand so tall and on his face was a smile she thought he'd forgotten he had. I did it, Mom, I got in. Within a second she was embracing him, arms wrapping around his warm body as his arms wrapped around her. I knew it, I knew it, I knew it. Tears fell from both their eyes as they sobbed from their shared joy. This is proof. You're destined for great things, Izuku. You bastard. The explosion went off right by Izuku's ear, causing a sharp pain to rip through his head and a ringing sound to knock him dizzy. How the fuck did you get in? You fucking cheating fuck. It was just the two of them. Called in especially to be thanked by their old homeroom teacher for making the class proud, though he seemed prouder of Katsuki than Izuku. It didn't matter. Izuku had his own pride now. Dusty and rusting, sure, but it was his and no one could take it from him. Not anymore. Though Katsuki was doing a damn good job of trying. Kake-kachin, pee-pee please I dash. Shut the fuck up. There was a sudden hand on his shirt, throwing him against the old brick wall of the school, and Izuku's senses felt overwhelmed by the smell of burning smoke and nitroglycerin. This was my destiny. My future. And now you're trying to get your stupid shitty hands on it. I was supposed to be the only one to get into UA from this bullshit school. His grip tightened and Izuku almost choked as the air was cut from his throat. You ruined it for me. For a moment Izuku almost apologized, anything to stop Katsuki from beating him for daring to step forwards out of the misery of his own life. But then the voice of his personalized hell hissed into his mind with the fury of 1,000 swinging swords, we are shadow and fire. We are not weak. Fight back. Coward, fight back. Heat exploded across Izuku's scars, swift and angry. A week ago he may have cried and panicked and attempted to do all he could to stop the thing from seizing control, resulting no doubt in his scars lighting on fire and bringing him to his knees screaming in pain. But that was a week ago. Things had changed. Kachin. His voice went low as inside he grabbed tight onto the pride he had rediscovered. The pride that he was on his own path, that he could be a hero, he had proven it to himself. He could do it. Suddenly his fingers were curling around Katsuki's wrist. Gee, get your fucking hand off me. Katsuki's heart skipped a beat. The air was raising around them, his mouth suddenly felt dry and his fury was marred by something he was unfamiliar with. Something that stabbed hard into his gut and twisted like barbed wire. Izuku looked up and their eyes met. Katsuki could swear that something was wrong with Izuku's gaze, it seemed darker somehow, as if all the light had been snuffed out of him. All except for his striking green irises, which he swore were glowing with something that made his soul shudder. Izuku's mouth curled from a fearful apprehension to a wolf's growl, and a quick thought shot through Katsuki's confused, spinning mind. Since when did Deku have fangs? I got in on my own merits, no cheating, no scheming. I got in on my own blood and sweat and tears. He shoved Katsuki back suddenly and, to his silent surprise, the taller boy let go, stumbling backward. Izuku's guts were twisting in fear, Panic was pulping his heart and his head was dizzy with the dread that any second Katsuki would swing that terrible right hook at his face. But Izuku could feel the pride of his spirit and the pulsing of vicious, infectious power from the thing. He let it carry him. Izuku whirled on Katsuki, his hand curling into a fist as he stood before him, his hair moving just slightly in the rising heat. I'm going to UA and nothing you do can stop me. Do the doors really need to be this big? Izuku asked himself as he stood outside his new classroom. Everything in UA was vast and imposing. At first, he thought it was an accessibility thing, but now he was starting to wonder if it was just for show. Having a few statues of famous heroes around was one thing, but this was getting a little silly. Still, he was here. He was wearing the uniform he had kept pressed and clean for a full 2 weeks before he even set off for UA. His backpack rested on his shoulders, filled with school equipment that he had checked and rechecked 100 times, and his mother had checked at least 1,000. This is a temple to vainglory. The thing hissed from within his brain, its voice 1,000 burning fires, 1,000 drowning screams, we belong in shadow. We belong here. Izuku found himself mumbling, his hands gripping tighter onto his shoulder straps. I earned this. The thing didn't reply, yet somehow, he could almost feel its smirk from within his heart. He really needed to talk to his mother about upping his medication. It was irritating how easy he was becoming with answering it back, and it troubled him that more than once he had been caught into its little game of answering with we and not I. It was also irritating how he was getting used to seeing monsters, no longer just small shadows or scuttling imps but actual, people-sized monsters. He had even spotted something flying through the sky the size of a car late one night. His episodes were becoming more oppressive, more sinister. Fear and gut-aching anxiety gripped him every time he spotted something that he knew wasn't real, even if he was sadly getting used to the feeling of horror every time he turned his head to see something with far too many eyes and legs and arms creeping towards him. And yet they would never touch him, never grab him or hurt him. They simply vanished once they got too close, being things invented in his own mind they weren't actually real. It didn't make it any less terrifying, of course, but it was the one small comfort he could take. Medication would solve it all, though. To drown his head in fog until he couldn't focus anymore. He could go back to being a walking zombie, free of terror but free of pretty much any other emotion too. And yet he knew to be a hero he had to use the thing. Even if he upped the medication, there was a decent chance within a year he'd be back to this point again. Not to mention it would certainly affect his class performance. He sighed, now wasn't the time to think about this. He could push it off until he couldn't push it off any longer, which was clearly a great plan with no downside. Besides, this was his first day in class. This was his golden opportunity to reinvent himself. Not as the ash-brained, creepy and useless Izuku Midoriya of Orudera Middle, but as the friendly and confident and absolutely not creepy Izuku Midoriya of UA High. As his shaky confidence gathered in his chest, he stepped forward and opened the door. And immediately his heart sank into the floor. Get your feet off the desk. The tall, teacher-like teenager that Izuku had been so helpfully glared at in the exam stood, arms in an almost perfect 90-degree angle as he shouted at Katsuki Bakugo. God hates me. That is probably true. Katsuki smirked at the taller boy. Ha! Shut the hell up, Four Eyes. That is incredibly disrespectful. The taller teenager almost reeled in shock. How can you be so rude to your fellow classmates on your first day? Because you're a fucking side character. Katsuki smirked as he folded his other foot over the desk. So get lost. Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot. The taller teenager put a hand to his chest. My name is Tenya Ida and I'm already bored of you. Jesus fucking Christ, I hope the whole fucking class isn't like Amber red eyes landed on Izuku and the boy froze in place. Izuku expected the blonde to rise from his seat, march over and immediately begin pummeling him for the rebellion he had shown him weeks before. But there was nothing. Just a look that caused Izuku's stomach to twist and a snarl as Katsuki turned his head away. Well, that was different. Izuku almost shuffled into the room, deciding to take full advantage of Katsuki's apparent kindness and... You! Stop! Tenya's voice called out to him and suddenly every eye in the class was on him. Izuku felt a rush of warmth across his scars as he froze utterly in place, his heart hammering in his chest as anxiety kicked him in the lungs. Before he could even reply, the teenager was marching over to him like some kind of uniformed robot. I am Tenya Ida from Semi-Private Academy and dash. The McKinnison takes such pride in his pathetic lineage. It's almost embarrassing. Hi. Izuku's voice squeaked out, desperate to drown out the voice of his curse. I heard. My name is Izuku Midoriya. It's a pleasure to meet you. Midoriya. I must apologize. Now that threw Izuku off, and for a second he simply stared blankly at his new classmate. You figured out there was something more to the exam. I underestimated you based on your appearance. He looked to one side as if in deep shame. Clearly you are better than me. Yes, we are. No. No, I'm not. I really had no idea. I just did what I dash. Oh. It's curly hair. The familiar voice caused him to turn suddenly, and there she was, like an actual beam of sunshine, the girl from the exam. The useless bitch is here too? This is a waste of our time. Izuku almost growled at that. Instead, however, he forced a smile to his face as he announced. Oh. Yeah, it's me. Hi there. A sudden thought hit him. She had been close when he had used the thing, close enough to see him if she had opened her eyes. A horror crept into his heart as he realized that there was a good chance that she knew what the thing looked like. Oh man, I never thanked you for saving my butt in the exam, ha. She reached forward suddenly and lightly punched him on the arm. You were amazing though. The creeping horror stopped. Amazing? Amazing? Yeah. Like, damn, she swung her fist down suddenly, and it was all, like, one pat inch and everything. I don't know how you did it, but damn it was cool. She laughed suddenly and smiled at Izuku. My name is Uraraka Achiko, nice to meet you, again. Izuku, at some point, had gone a bright beet red. Never in his life had anyone used the words cool and amazing when referring to him, and, quite honestly, he had no idea how to deal with it. Did people just accept compliments like that? Should he say something back? Was there some social ritual to being called cool? Would he be uncool if he even acknowledged he was called cool? This was somehow just as terrifying as the thought of Uraraka possibly knowing what the thing looked like. Well, I didn't really dash. Finally, you're all here. The new voice was not one of a student, that was immediately apparent. Izuku looked over Uraraka's shoulder only to see what looked like a giant yellow caterpillar. One with a human face. Fear crept up his spine and he gritted his teeth. Now was not the time to be having an episode. He almost turned away and marched to his seat from sheer desperation when Uraraka turned to and it hit him like a bucket of ice-cold water to the face. This wasn't an episode, that thing was real. The caterpillar stood up and looked out over the classroom from its position in the doorway. His voice was low, almost droning, yet laced with a subtle authority that demanded attention. It took you all 8 seconds to shut up. This won't do. You kids aren't logical enough. He sighed heavily and the caterpillar began unzipping itself, revealing its skin to be nothing more than a sleeping bag. Out stepped what Izuku first thought was some kind of hobo, and he wondered if he should call campus security. However, there was something in the way the man held himself, the way his exhausted, bloodshot eyes scanned the classroom that told him he was judging the book by its cover. A son of David? Izuku caught himself before he could react to the comment. What the hell was it talking about now? It didn't matter, half of what it said was just nonsense to upset him anyway. This is the hero course, I expect you all to be better than this. He stepped forwards and again scanned the class with tired eyes, causing, as Izuku noticed, more than a few of his classmates to shrink from his gaze. I am your homeroom teacher, Shota Aizawa. A collective gasp rose from the classroom as Izuku stared at the strange man. His gaze grew even wider as the disheveled teacher reached into his sleeping bag and drew out a blue, red and white-looking outfit. "These are your gym clothes. Put them on and meet me on Field A in 10 minutes. No slacking." But, we're supposed to be attending our opening ceremony." Uraraka's whining voice rang out suddenly, and it was joined by a few murmuring agreements. Shota frowned. "It's a waste of time. All you need to know is that you're on the hero course and that we only expect the best. That's why you're going out into the field. I need to test you all on your physical and quirk-related abilities. Now you have 9 minutes, I suggest you get moving." The entire time he got changed into his gym clothes, Izuku was gripped with the thought of having to use the thing openly in front of other people. Sure, he'd done that in the exam, but that had been an emergency. Now he was simply expected to just use it. Like anyone else. In front of people he'd be spending the next 3 years with. What would they even think of him when it became quickly apparent he had only the barest grasps on the reins of a monster that lived inside his blood? However, once he got onto the field, what he saw swept away the anxiety of using the thing, at least for a few moments. Rope swings over sand pits, walls with footholds, crawling spaces, tires and hanging ladders leading both up and down huge ramps, each with their own swirling, spinning, chaotic-looking devices all designed to test a person to their absolute limit. There were 2 rows of these courses, each a perfect mirror of the other. "Welcome to the UA Student Obstacle Course," Aizawa announced in a bored tone. "I'll be sending you out in sets of 2 to complete the course as fast as you can. Now I'm sure you've done something like this before." There were a few murmurs from the class, though Izuku kept his mouth shut. He'd always been left out of these kinds of things, and usually by choice. If he had an episode while climbing a rope, he could fall and break his neck. Now he supposed he had no choice. However, before I'm sure you were told not to use your quirks to keep it fair. That is illogical. During the test I will be watching to see not just how physically fit you are, but also to see how well you handle your quirks to complete the course. Aizawa continued, bloodshot eyes scanning the class disdainfully. Each of you got onto this course because you passed a written and physical exam. However, such things like speed or destructive power don't matter when looking for raw potential. Izuku felt himself stiffen at the statement as a rod of cold iron ran down his spine. What was his raw potential? Did he even have any? The thing was powerful, he would easily admit that, but the way Aizawa talked indicated he was looking for something more than just power. He was looking for ability, usefulness, practicality, and perhaps the drive within each individual student. Izuku had to admit, for as scary as his new homeroom teacher was, it was kind of a smart move to make. You'll race against your opponent as well as for your own personal best. Whoever comes in last overall will, of course, be expelled. If you have no potential, you have no place in my classroom. And that was a horrible move to make. Anxiety flared through him like a suddenly lit match, heat washing over his scars and biting softly across his limbs. Oh God, I'm going to fail. We will succeed. How? How? We are shadow and fire. We will succeed. Izuku bit his lip though, weirdly enough, he couldn't help but feel a sliver of confidence run through him. Could he win this? The thing was powerful, and he'd been working out all summer long. He was sure physically he was strong enough to at least land an okay time without his quirk usage. But he knew he still had at best 3 shots within him, since simply letting go was absolutely out of the question. All he had to do was try his best and pick his moments carefully. Maybe then he could squeak through with a decent enough time not to get expelled. All right. He mumbled to himself as his eyes scanned the course, examining each part in turn. I can probably get past that point and that point fine, that might be an issue but I think I can jump dash. You. The voice of his teacher snapped Izuku out of his thoughts and he almost literally jumped. Aizawa's eyes narrowed on him and a scowl appeared, barely hidden by the odd gray scarf he kept around his neck. Stop mumbling. There were a few snickers from the class and Izuku went bright red. Sorry, sir. Aizawa seemed to study him for just a moment more, looking away. Izuku, however, caught something in that gaze that wasn't just a teacher silencing his student. There was almost a hint of judgment to it, as if he was being filed and logged away for future reference. It made Izuku all the more nervous. Now his teacher thought he was weird. First two up, Denki Kaminari and Hantasiro. This went on for some time while students, each called in pairs, were set onto the what almost immediately became obvious was not actually an obstacle course, but some kind of villainous torture machine designed to beat students up in the most humiliating fashion possible. Some students, of course, managed to fly through it. Katsuki being one of them, another boy named Shoto Todoroki being another. Some, however, such as the blonde French boy, who apparently wasn't French at all and was actually called Yuga Aoyama, ended up coming out of it looking like they'd gone a few rounds with all might. Even so, Izuku watched everything with rapt attention, mentally noting down how certain people mastered certain obstacles or even avoided them altogether. The displays of amazing quirk usage made him nervous for his own usage of the thing, but even so he had begun to narrow down 3 points which he was sure would be the best moments to use it. One point was a gigantic wall which he would need to possibly jump right over to save the time he needed to not be expelled. The second was an odd part of the range where one had to throw a ball at a target, hitting it to open the next and ending part of the course. The harder one threw, the better score one got. Using the thing there would surely gain him much needed points. The third was a huge, almost vertical ramp which one had to climb up to pass the finish line. Its placement was devious, obviously designed to draw out whatever lasting strength one had left at the end of a punishing set of challenges. Yet, even with a basic plan of action in mind, his stomach still turned to jelly when he heard his name called out. Izuku Midoriya and Eijiro Kirishima. The teenager stepped forwards, practically shaking in his shoes as he approached the suddenly all too imposing obstacle course. If he could pale he would have done, instead heat crept across his scars and his limbs felt the tug of shadowy power as the thing grinned wolfishly from within his heart. It hungered for this challenge. Izuku did not. "Hey man," a voice, friendly and boisterous, came from his left and Izuku turned his head. Just a few paces from him stood a boy, apparently named Eijiro Kirishima, with the brightest and spikiest red hair Izuku had ever seen. He warmed up slightly as light red eyes matched the sudden grin that flashed across shark-like teeth. Honestly, Izuku had never seen anyone who looked like him before, though the hair rang a bell. "Good luck, yeah? I know we could be expelled if we do bad, but still," he held up a fist which suddenly took on a solid, stone-like texture. "Let's rock this thing." Izuku suddenly found himself smiling back, though his was made more about paper than rock. Sure, good luck, luck. Hey! Kirishima's grin grew wider and his eyes lit up. "You've got shark teeth too." "Hell yeah." He took a few paces towards Izuku suddenly and held out his fist. "Tooth brothers." "Tooth brothers?" Oh okay, why not?" Izuku held out a shaking fist and bumped it lightly against Kirishima's. "Tooth brothers." "Awesome." The redhead grinned, though quickly hopped back into place when Aizawa scolded him for moving from the starting line. Izuku breathed deep. The warmth of infernal fire was licking along his scars and the hints of terrible power teased the corners of his mind, but he found his focus narrowing on what was just before him. His legs felt like jelly and his heart was starting to pound, but his head remained clear enough at least to know it was now or never. He had passed the entrance exam, he had started to master his curse, he had proven his own doubts wrong over and over again for the past 11 months. His fingers pressed hard against the rubber flooring of the obstacle course and sharp teeth gritted in his mouth. "We can do this." The thing whispered like cold ice on old gravel, "We are shadow and fire." For some reason, in that small moment, Izuku believed it. Their homeroom teacher came to stand at the edge of the course as his gaze moved from one boy to the other, each kneeling down in preparation. With all the passion of a DMV worker, he loudly announced, "All right, get set, go." Izuku burst into life. The first ramp was scaled easily, as was the drop immediately afterward, which Izuku turned into a roll. He leapt up, grabbing the swinging rope over the sand pit and made it across without worry. All the while his heart pounded, his limbs burned with heat and the wide, wolfish, nightmare grin of the thing within him widened. But he was doing it. His entire focus was on the course, rushing and pushing as he could through each second. A swinging padded arm missed him by a hair as he dodged, then jumped, then ducked and rolled and ran as he navigated the course. He was onto the rope cling next, swinging and jumping and grabbing as he did so. He glanced a look left and, to a mix of hot anger and shock, he saw Ijiro almost neck and neck. An emotion gripped Izuku suddenly across his chest. An emotion he was utterly unfamiliar with, but one he embraced with wide arms. The burning desire to win. Sharp teeth flashed in a demon's grimace as he forced his body to go faster, to work harder. His lungs were starting to burn and his limbs aching with swift and strong usage, but he knew he could do this, he knew he could make it. Then first true obstacle approached. The huge, straight wall with only a few minor handholds. He had seen several of his classmates struggle here, though even as he approached, the image of Katsuki simply blasting his way up the wall flashed through his mind. Despite a lifetime of being beaten down, being shoved into the dirt and told he was useless, he suddenly decided something like it was simple, irrefutable fact. I can beat Kachin up this thing. The moment he got to it, he stopped and closed his eyes, just as he had practiced before. One deep, shuddering breath as his focus turned from the course to his shaking legs, to the teasing darkness of black power, to the call of the thing within his blood. It responded. He felt it flood through him suddenly, boosted by his pounding heart and acidic lungs and his burning wish for victory. Izuku forced it into his legs where his scars lit up like hot coals. He could feel it, the muscles and bones shifting and tearing and moving within his skin. The ground burned and blackened under his feet, but he hardly noticed as he gritted his teeth through the knife-like pain of the flesh change. Then he bent his knees, leaning onto toes which seemed too sharp and too long for his own shoes, and jumped. From somewhere he heard gasps, perhaps even a shout, but it was all drowned by the sudden rushing wind through his ears as he shot upwards like a blue and white rocket. He cleared the wall. For a moment his heart leapt within his chest as the absolute joy of actually doing something amazing gripped him. He had jumped the wall. The entire wall. Then suddenly he realized why that was a bad thing. He had jumped the wall. Walls had two sides. The other side to this wall was a direct drop back down. Izuku began falling like a brick tossed from a skyscraper, and he knew he had barely a second to think of a way to not break both his ankles the moment he landed. The wall. Izuku turned, threw out his hand and forced every remaining ember of the thing through his palm. For a microsecond time seemed to slow to a crawl, and he saw it, the black shadow coating his fingers and palm at an impossible speed, his scars lighting up with the infernal blue flame like the window of a furnace, and then... boom! The force of the explosion threw him away from the wall like a bullet from a gun. There was no time to think, no time to prepare as he hit the top of the monkey bars with a painful sounding crack. He bounced along them, spinning and hitting them again, and then rolling to a fall from the other end, hitting the padded floor with a painful cry. He gripped his chest tightly in a tender hug as he curled up, the smell of smoke fire and burning cloth filling his senses. His chest felt numb, and the raw, powerful pain of using the thing pounded through every inch of his being, especially his chest and legs. He wanted to cry out in agony, to curl into a ball and sob bitter, stinging tears. We must move. But there was an obstacle course to beat. His teeth ground in his mouth. Get up, Izuku. Get up, get the fuck up, Izuku. On our feet. We must win. Izuku forced his screaming limbs to work. He knew there was only the ball and target test, then the huge ending ramp. His chest was radiating pain, and he guessed he'd fractured, maybe even broke one of his ribs. Still, he could do this. He could use the thing one more time and force his body up the ramp to victory. We are Shadow Dash. And Flame, yeah, I know. Though somehow the mantra brought him some measure of confidence. It at least forced his limbs back into motion, and at least they were both on board to finish the course. He began moving again. Somewhere in the distance he could hear someone screaming, but he didn't care. Schizophrenia or cheering classmates, he had no idea, but he couldn't focus on that right now. His body cried out in protest as he hobbled over to the throwing range, picked up the simple ball and looked to the target. Just this last one and he could do it. Just this last obstacle, then the other last obstacle, and he'd win. He couldn't aim straight, his arm was shaking from the pain throbbing from his ribs, and the energy sapped from his body from using the thing was making him feel like lead. He forced his arm back up, all he needed to do was fire it at the target, which was basically a giant mattress with a bullseye on it. Focus, our aim is true. Izuku frowned, held up his arm and breathed. Once again his eyes closed, once again he opened the floodgates and allowed his curse to consume his arm. At the last possible second he moved back and threw the ball. Again for another microsecond he felt the thing reshaping his bone, muscle, and skin. He felt the claws burst from his fingertips, the burning force of raw power rushing through his arm. Boom! The force of the blast threw him backward and his body screamed from the pain that tore through every limb. Blue fire and black smoke swarmed him like a hurricane before dissipating just a second later. Izuku coughed the smoke from his burning lungs. He was struggling to get back onto his feet, the world around him was dizzy and sharp and moving and turning. He could see the mattress though. He could see the vast, black bruise that is thrown and punched into it and the dancing blue fires that had caught along the net of the throwing range. That had to be enough, right? Surely. He looked up to where a scoreboard blinked out a number. It was a pretty high number, 832. What that meant he wasn't sure, but he knew it was good, certainly within the high ranges of the others who had taken part so far. He grinned a wobbling, weak grin to himself. He didn't know he had it in him. We must move. The thing had a point. Except he was finding it hard to move. He turned and the world swam in a mixture of flooding colors and sharpened edges before it mushed back together again. He had to keep going, he had to win. He wanted to throw up everything in his stomach, but he had to win. The previously closed area, blocked off by a simple plastic wall, had now opened to reveal the final, daunting challenge. A huge warped wall ramp. It was much like the beginning one, except a far sharper curve. And he had to get up it. Briefly he thought about using the thing on his legs once more, but he knew he wouldn't have the control. He would slip and either collapse on the burning scars of his legs or the thing would simply take control. That wouldn't be good. No, all he had for this last challenge was raw, unadulterated willpower. He could do this, he could do this, he could do this. With an almighty scream of determined rage, Izuku threw himself at the ramp and managed 3 steps before tripping forward and landing flat on his face. Another strangled yelp of pain, but at this point he was being driven on pure adrenaline. The throbbing ache of his body being pushed to the edge was forcing him forward, demanding results. He got up again, the earth still spinning from under him as he backed up, wobbling, then charged, pushing himself forwards before leaping upward and hoping against all hope he would grab the edge of the ramp. Fingers connected, digging into the cold metal of the warped wall's edge. But there was no strength in his arms and already they burned and screamed and ached from the effort of simply reaching forwards. He would lose. He would lose because he had done too much and demanded too much. For just a fleeting moment, tears welled in his eyes as the thought of another crushing loss entered his heart. We will win. He could feel it. The oil-thick flood of power moving through his body, threatening to down his limbs, his heart, his head in shadow and flame. No! Izuku knew that feeling. He had felt it only rarely, but every time someone had been hurt, someone had suffered because the thing had slipped through his shaking grasp. He had less than a second to do this in, less than a second to think of some way to stop the living nightmare of his blood from consuming his body and wreaking havoc on everything around him. I won't let you hurt anyone. Izuku screamed as he pushed everything of the thing into his arm, holding it down and forcing the venomous power through his fingertips. The ground under him exploded with the force of a bomb, throwing him upwards like a tossed ball. His body screamed with pain, his chest feeling like someone was driving a rusty sword through his lungs, before he fell sharply and landed with an uncomfortable and wince-worthy crunch onto the top of the ramp, which was of course followed by more screaming from the boy. His body was on fire, he was sure of it, and through his swimming skull, he could hear the nightmare voice of the thing howling 1,000 foul curses at him, blaming him for their imminent loss and his lack of strength. Izuku ignored it, he was in too much pain to even hear half of what it was saying. He had used too much, he knew that, He was on the verge of blacking out from complete exhaustion, but he had to win. All that was needed was one last, tiny burst of energy and he could do it. He summoned everything that he had left, everything that he at least dared to gather into his screaming muscles, and in one heroic jolt of movement he threw himself up, smashing the buzzer with his hand before collapsing back down into a piled heap. Above him, he heard a little jingle and green lights lit up. He'd done it. He'd won. And that's when Izuku finally blacked out. He awoke with a spasm-like jolt a few minutes later, and for a moment his vision was filled purely with a pair of large red eyes gazing down on him. Dude, are you okay? We are foolish. The thing almost immediately scolded him like an angry housewife, causing Izuku to wince and grind his teeth. Though oddly he could hear the exhaustion within its nightmare voice, almost as if it too had been drained by his reckless actions. A Pyrrhic victory is no victory at all. Izuku immediately began to mumble a reply before being suddenly cut off by the excitable redhead. Oh, good. You're awake. The world was a spinning circus of colors, lights, sounds and sensations that were all melding and fixing back into place. His chest ached so bad he thought he would faint again, and he felt as though each of his limbs had been violently pulled off and stitched back on again. Give him some air. Another voice joined in suddenly from his side. It was Uraraka. He doesn't look too good. To be honest, he didn't look that good to start with. Kirishima replied with a shrug. I'm fine. Izuku mumbled out, though it was mostly lost on the people who seemed to be fussing over him. Are you all right? You hit those monkey bars pretty hard, and I think I heard something crack when you landed on the top. Uraraka was hovering over him. And now we have these filthy sinners fussing over us. This is pathetic. We are better than this. Shut up. Izuku mumbled as he began to pick himself back up. They're not sinners. Who's not a sinner? Uraraka suddenly asked as her wide, kind eyes frowned in confusion. Izuku immediately panicked as he realized he'd been talking out loud again. Wah? Oh. Nothing. Just, mumbling things, probably got a concussion or something, you know? He attempted a very fake laugh, but the moment he did so his chest blossomed with pain and he winced while instinctively raising a hand up to cradle it. You are hurt. I knew it. Uraraka frowned as she stood up and took a step back. Izuku looked around only to realize that Kirishima had dragged him back over to the bleachers, though he had been laid out on the nice warm grass. Oddly enough, he could see Katsuki standing on the very far end of the seats glaring nothing short of pure, concentrated hate at him. Izuku only blinked dumbly at this as he suddenly realized that this was, actually, the first time Katsuki had ever seen him use the thing in any context that wasn't causing himself intense pain. Though technically it still was within that realm since he had beat himself into utter exhaustion and possibly broke a rib. Still, it had been better to knock himself out than let it take his body and slaughter half the class. The thing grinned within his blood. Let him throw his little tantrum. The brat will soon learn what we are truly capable of. Izuku Midoriya. The boy's attention was immediately pulled forward. It was Aizawa. At some point he had come to stand in front of the small group surrounding Izuku, his arms folded sternly across his chest. He didn't sound pleased. He didn't look pleased. In fact, pleased was pretty damn far from anything which Aizawa represented at that exact moment. Pushing yourself into unconsciousness was not part of the test. I'm sorry, Izuku mumbled out as his senses continued to fix back into place. I really wanted to win. Hurting yourself isn't conducive to being a hero. Aizawa sliced in with ice-cold authority. Your use of your quirk is unwieldy and uncontrolled. Unless you learn to use it better, you won't make it in this course. Izuku sat in silent despair as the man reached into his pocket and drew out a small slip. Take this pass and go see the old lady, get fixed up. I'll send word if you've passed or not. The Hebrew speaks lies, the thing practically spat into his ear. We are power and blood and fire, we are not unwieldy. The teenager gritted his teeth together as he fought back a sharp, snappy reply. Now he suddenly understood what it meant by son of David. Where the thing had gotten such an idea Izuku didn't know, but it was insulting and rude and he hated it. He hated the thing for saying it. He hated himself for knowing that it had come from inside him, from the curse in his own blood. He hated the fact that his teacher, on his first day, had already pinned him as the problem kid who had no idea what he was doing. With a shaking hand he reached out and took the note from Aizawa, and with the help of Uraraka and Kirishima, he was lifted to his feet. He hadn't asked for their help of course and had already moved to do it himself, and yet, their arms had scooped up under him and helped him up anyway. What was it with people being nice to him around here? Didn't they see what the thing was like? Didn't they see the horror that he saw? They certainly would think twice about him if they knew the things it said about them. But that was his curse. A normal, plain-looking boy was the cover for something made of bile and horror and hate. As he began to leave he turned to see Tenya take his place on the course next to a boy he didn't know, one who had the head of a crow, beak, feathers and all. For a second their eyes met and Izuku almost tripped as the thing suddenly seemed to jump within the walls of his mind. A seventh son. Oh, will you please, shut the hell up. Izuku openly mumbled to himself as he rubbed his head and made his way towards the main campus building. He had fractured his rib cage, which wasn't as bad as what he had thought, actually. Recovery girl fussed at him for being hurt on his first day and the forehead smooch of healing had almost made him to go sleep, but he was otherwise set to go, albeit with a warning to not exert himself too much over the next few days. Just before he left Recovery Girl had informed him that Aizawa had sent a message along telling him he had passed and that the expulsion threat had been nothing more than a logical ruse. Izuku's relief was almost palpable. He'd done it, he'd made it through his first day in one piece. As Izuku made his way back to class he looked once more to his scarred hands. A vision flashed before his eyes. The void black ink that consumed his skin like leather, the vicious, talon-like claws that had grown from the tips of his fingers. His hands curled into fists and dropped to his sides. His teacher was right. He had almost no real control over the thing, and what little control he had was unwieldy. He blatantly couldn't use his power without exhausting himself, and using it to excess ruined him to uselessness. But how else could he possibly use it? It did what it wished, when it wished, and without gripping onto it tightly with two hands at all times he would utterly lose control and then... Whumph! I am so sorry. Izuku immediately stammered as he stumbled back away from whoever it was he had just walked into. He looked up, his eyes wide and his hands up in shock, but the moment he locked eyes he froze. Well. You know, I believe I told you once before to look where you're going. Black, pitiless eyes smiled back at him, the shining dark, freezing hot blue flashing with humor. The businessman. Dash. It's good to see you pass the exam, son, well done. You know I was rooting for you. He chuckled in a genial manner as he brushed his fog gray suit down. Again, he was dressed immaculately, sharp and cool like a middle-aged CEO. When I had time, of course, most of my day had been taken up with meetings. It's a new school year, after all, lots of things to iron out before the chaos starts. Thank you? Izuku really had no idea what to say to the man and began trying to edge around him. I should really get going though, so dash. What's your name, young man? The man again looked to him, gazing at him through his spectacles. If you're going to keep walking into me, I might as well know your name. For a moment Izuku found himself unable to form words. Why did this man make him feel so nervous? So on edge? And why did he seem so familiar? He knew he'd only ever met him once before, and yet there was just something about him, something right on the tip of his tongue. So you're going to make me go first, huh? A wise move, son, names have power after all. He put a hand up to his heart suddenly and gave a slightly theatrical bow. My name is Hisashi Hokori. Izuku Midoriya. Izuku slipped his own name out before he had even considered it. It was the polite thing to do after all, right? It was so subtle, so fleeting that he almost missed it. A single microcosm of something that passed over Hisashi's face. Izuku was only half sure he saw it, but he was certain it had been there. Pride. Izuku Midoriya. Hisashi nodded to the boy as a sign of respect, the same warm smile still sitting on his lips. A good name. Well then, Izuku, I shall let you get back to class. Which class are you in, by the way? Oh, Class 1A of the Hero course. The young man replied swiftly, though again he felt as though he should be holding his tongue. Why though? This man was doing nothing wrong, nothing out of the ordinary other than being polite. Perhaps it was simply because he was so unused to people being so nice to him. And yet there was just something off about him. Hiding just under the surface. Like a worm crawling through the center of an apple. Ah, Aizawa's class. Yes. Hisashi scratched his chin thoughtfully. You better hurry then, he's not the nicest of people at the best of times, though he has a good soul, deep down. Pay attention and do your best and you'll have no problems. Alright, thank you, sir. Izuku gave him another quick nod and turned to leave, finding his step was just a little more hurried than before. And yet even as he was leaving he heard the man call out one last time. And remember, Izuku Midoriya, the teenager turned his head just in time to see the man throw him a wink. I'm still rooting for you. The fanfic is linked below. Thank you all for watching this video and goodbye.